Chapter 1: The Rise to Power: How Ordinary Men Became Monsters. As we settle in tonight, let's explore one of history's most troubling questions. How do ordinary people become capable of extraordinary evil? It's a heavy topic, but understanding it helps us recognize the warning signs and protect the freedoms we hold dear. So get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's journey through history together, examining how some of humanity's darkest chapters began with seemingly ordinary individuals who transformed into monsters. The story of evil dictators rarely begins with obvious villainy. Most didn't emerge from the shadows twirling mustaches and announcing their plans for world domination. Instead, they often started as unremarkable people, failed artists, struggling students, minor bureaucrats, or military officers with chips on their shoulders. What transformed them wasn't usually a single moment of choosing evil, but rather a gradual descent, step by step, decision by decision, until they had traveled so far from their starting point that there was no way back. Take Adolf Hitler, perhaps history's most infamous dictator. In his youth, he was a failed artist living in Vienna, sleeping in homeless shelters and making a meager living painting postcards. He was described by those who knew him as odd but not particularly remarkable, a loner who spent his time reading and developing increasingly radical political views. The transformation from struggling artist to genocidal dictator didn't happen overnight. It was a process that took decades, shaped by personal failures, national humiliation, economic chaos, and the dangerous alchemy of charisma and hatred. The path to dictatorship often begins with genuine grievances and real problems that need solving. Germany after World War I was a nation in crisis, humiliated by defeat, economically devastated by war, reparations, politically unstable with weak democratic institutions. Into this chaos stepped Hitler, offering simple explanations for complex problems and promising to restore German greatness. His early speeches weren't about gas chambers and world war. They were about jobs, dignity, and national pride. The evil came later, wrapped in the flag and carrying a cross, as the saying goes. Joseph Stalin's rise followed a different pattern, but shared similar elements. Born Joseph Vissarionovich Dugashvili in Georgia, he came from genuine poverty and faced real oppression under Tsarist Russia. His early revolutionary activities, robbing banks to fund the Bolshevik cause, organizing strikes, spreading revolutionary propaganda, could be seen as fighting against an unjust system. But somewhere along the way, the means became more important than the ends, and the revolutionary became something far worse than what he had fought against. The transformation of Stalin from revolutionary to tyrant is particularly instructive. In the early days of the Soviet Union, he was seen as a competent but unremarkable administrator. Comrade Card Index, they called him, mocking his bureaucratic nature. While Lenin and Trotsky gave stirring speeches, Stalin quietly built networks of loyalty, placing his supporters in key positions, gathering information, waiting. His rise to power wasn't dramatic. It was methodical, patient, and utterly ruthless. By the time his rivals realized the danger, it was too late. What's fascinating and terrifying about studying dictators is recognizing how they exploit ordinary human psychology. They understand that people want to belong to something greater than themselves. They recognize that in times of uncertainty, people crave strong leadership and simple answers. They know that fear and hope are powerful motivators, and they become masters at manipulating both. They don't usually start by demanding terrible things. They begin by offering solutions, promising protection, and gradually expanding what people are willing to accept. Mao Zedong's journey to power illustrates another common pattern: the revolutionary who never stops revolting, even after winning. Born into a relatively prosperous peasant family, Mao was educated and had opportunities many Chinese people of his era could only dream of. Yet he positioned himself as the champion of the peasantry against all forms of authority. His long march, where communist forces retreated thousands of miles to escape nationalist armies, became a foundation myth for his rule. The hardship and sacrifice of that journey convinced his followers that any future hardship was justified for the cause. The personality traits that enable someone to become a dictator are disturbingly common: narcissism, the absolute conviction that they are special, destined for greatness, and justified in whatever they do; paranoia, the belief that enemies are everywhere, that constant vigilance and preemptive action are necessary; lack of empathy, the ability to see other humans as statistics, obstacles, or tools rather than as people with their own hopes and fears. These traits exist on a spectrum in many people, but in future dictators, they combine with opportunity and circumstance to create monsters. Pol Pot's transformation is perhaps one of the most extreme examples. Born Saleth Sar to a prosperous farming family, he was a mediocre student who failed to complete his studies in Paris. But in those Parisian cafes, he absorbed radical ideas about remaking society from scratch. His vision for Cambodia wasn't just about political change, it was about fundamentally transforming human nature itself, creating a peasant utopia by destroying everything that came before. The quiet, unremarkable student became the architect of one of history's most radical and murderous regimes. The role of ideology in creating dictators cannot be understated. Whether it's racial supremacy, class struggle, religious extremism, or nationalist fervor, ideology provides the justification for increasingly extreme actions. It transforms murder into necessity, oppression into liberation, and cruelty into kindness. Ideology tells the dictator that they're not destroying lives, they're building a better future. It tells them that their victims aren't really victims, they're enemies of progress, parasites, or subhumans who don't deserve compassion. But ideology alone doesn't create dictators. There must also be opportunity, usually in the form of social chaos, institutional weakness, or power vacuums. The Weimar Republic's weak democratic institutions couldn't withstand the pressures of economic depression and political extremism. Russia's provisional government after the fall of the Tsar was too fragmented to resist the disciplined Bolsheviks. China's century of humiliation and civil war created the conditions for Mao's rise. Cambodia's instability following independence and the spillover from the Vietnam War opened the door for the Khmer Rouge. Saddam Hussein's rise in Iraq shows how dictators often emerge from within existing power structures. Starting as a low-level enforcer for the Ba'ath Party, he literally shot his way up the ranks. His uncle, who raised him, filled his head with ideas about Arab nationalism and the glory of power. Saddam learned early that violence worked, that people who feared you would obey you, and that mercy was weakness. His rise wasn't a popular revolution, but a series of coups, purges, and betrayals until he stood alone at the top. The psychology of followers is just as important as the psychology of leaders in understanding how dictatorships arise. People don't usually follow evil leaders because they themselves are evil. They follow because they're afraid, because they believe the lies, because they benefit from the system, or because opposing it seems impossible or too costly. The dictator's genius lies in making compliance seem like the only rational choice, in making resistance feel futile, and in making participation feel patriotic or even moral. Francisco Franco's path to power in Spain illustrates how military strongmen become dictators. A career military officer who rose through the ranks in Spain's colonial wars in Morocco, Franco was known for his competence, ruthlessness, and conservative views. When Spain's Second Republic seemed to threaten traditional institutions, the church, the military, the landed aristocracy, Franco positioned himself as their defender. The Spanish Civil War that brought him to power was marketed not as a grab for personal power, but as a crusade to save Spain from communism and chaos. The importance of propaganda in the rise of dictators cannot be overstated. They understand that controlling the narrative is as important as controlling the military. Hitler's rallies were masterpieces of psychological manipulation. The dramatic lighting, the stirring music, the choreographed crowds, all designed to make individuals feel part of something magnificent. Stalin's cult of personality transformed him from Joseph Dugashvili into the man of steel, the father of the nation, the genius leader whose wisdom guided every aspect of Soviet life. Kim Il-sung's establishment of North Korea's dictatorship shows how quickly democratic rhetoric can become totalitarian reality. Initially presenting himself as a nationalist hero fighting against Japanese occupation and for Korean independence, Kim systematically eliminated rivals, centralized power, and created a personality cult that would make Stalin blush. Within a few years of taking power, he had transformed from liberation fighter to God King, establishing a hereditary dictatorship that continues to this day. The role of violence in the dictator's rise is central, but often gradually escalated. They don't usually begin with mass murder. Instead, violence starts small and targeted, and a political rival eliminated here, a troublesome journalist silenced there. Each act of violence that goes unpunished emboldens them for the next, slightly larger act. The population becomes gradually desensitized, each atrocity making the next seem less shocking. By the time the killing reaches industrial scale, the mechanisms are in place, the executioners are trained, and resistance seems impossible. Idi Amin's rise in Uganda demonstrates how personal charisma can mask brutal intentions. Initially popular as a jovial, larger-than-life figure who overthrew an unpopular government, Amin presented himself as a man of the people. His humor, his accessibility, his apparent simplicity all made him seem harmless, even charming, but behind the buffoonish exterior was a calculating killer who understood that being underestimated was a weapon. By the time people recognized the monster behind the mask, he had already consolidated power through terror. The international community's role in enabling dictators is an uncomfortable truth. Many dictators rise to power with foreign support, seen as useful allies against greater threats or as guarantors of stability. The West supported Franco as a bulwark against communism. The Soviet Union backed numerous dictators as part of Cold War competition. The pattern continues today. The international community often prioritizes short-term stability over long-term justice, enabling dictators to consolidate power while the world looks away. The economic factors in the rise of dictatorships are crucial to understand. Economic chaos creates desperation, and desperate people are willing to trade freedom for the promise of stability and prosperity. Hitler's promise to overcome the Depression and restore German prosperity was central to his appeal. Mao promised land reform and economic justice. Even the most brutal dictators usually begin by promising to improve people's material conditions, and sometimes they even deliver, at least for their supporters, at least for a while. Robert Mugabe's transformation from liberation hero to dictator shows how the corrupting nature of power works over time. Initially hailed as a hero for leading Zimbabwe to independence, Mugabe was educated, articulate, and seemed committed to reconciliation and progress. But decades of power changed him, or perhaps revealed what was always there. The liberation fighter who promised freedom became the tyrant who destroyed his country rather than give up power. His story reminds us that dictators aren't born, they're made, shaped by circumstances, choices, and the intoxicating drug of absolute power. The role of fear in creating and maintaining dictatorships is fundamental. Fear of chaos leads people to accept strong leaders. Fear of the other, whether defined by race, class, religion, or politics, justifies persecution. Fear of the regime keeps people silent. Fear of losing what little they have prevents resistance. Dictators are masters of fear, knowing exactly how to calibrate it. Too little, and people might rebel. Too much, and society collapses. They create environments where everyone is afraid of everyone else, where trust becomes impossible, and where the only safety seems to lie in absolute obedience. As we reflect on how ordinary people become history's greatest monsters, we must recognize that the potential for evil exists in every society, perhaps in every human heart. The dictators we've discussed weren't aliens or demons. They were human beings who, through a combination of personality, circumstance, and choice, became capable of unimaginable cruelty. Understanding their rise isn't about excusing their crimes. It's about recognizing the warning signs, strengthening the institutions that prevent their emergence, and maintaining the eternal vigilance that freedom requires. The transformation from ordinary person to evil dictator doesn't happen overnight. It's a process of moral compromises, incremental power grabs, and gradually expanding circles of acceptable violence. Each step makes the next easier, each crime makes the next seem less criminal, until eventually the unthinkable becomes routine. This is why the early stages matter so much, why the first violations of democratic norms, the first attacks on free press, the first scapegoating of minorities must be resisted. By the time the dictator reveals their true nature, it's often too late. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, perhaps reflect on the fragility of freedom and the vigilance it requires. The dictators of history remind us that civilization is not inevitable, that progress can be reversed, and that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary evil when circumstances align. But they also remind us that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary good, of resistance, of courage, of refusing to participate in evil, even at great personal cost. In the end, dictatorships rise when good people do nothing. They fall when enough people say, "No more." The study of evil is ultimately a study of good, of what we must protect, what we must resist, and what we must never become. Sweet dreams, and may you rest knowing that understanding darkness helps us better appreciate and protect the light. Chapter 2: The Machinery of Terror: How Dictatorships Control Population. As we continue our somber journey through history's darkest chapters, let's explore how dictators, once in power, maintain their grip on entire nations. It's a quieter kind of evil than conquest or revolution, the slow, methodical construction of systems designed to crush human spirit and eliminate resistance. Understanding these mechanisms isn't just historical curiosity, It's a warning about how freedom dies, not always with a bang, but often with a whimper. The architecture of oppression is remarkably consistent across different dictatorships, regardless of ideology or geography, whether in Nazi Germany, Stalinist Russia, Maoist China, or Pol Pot's Cambodia. Certain patterns emerge, patterns that reveal the universal techniques of totalitarian control. These systems don't spring into existence fully formed. They're built piece by piece, each component designed to reinforce the others, creating a prison without walls where the bars are in people's minds. The first and perhaps most important tool in the dictator's arsenal is the control of information. In George Orwell's 1984, he wrote that who controls the past controls the future, who controls the present controls the past. Dictators understand this instinctively. They don't just censor inconvenient truths, they create alternative realities where they are always right, always winning, always beloved. In Stalin's Soviet Union, photographs were routinely doctored to remove purged officials, literally erasing them from history. In North Korea today, the entire population lives in an information bubble where their leader is a genius who never defecates and can control the weather. The creation of these alternative realities requires more than just censorship. It requires active propaganda that fills every available space. In Nazi Germany, Joseph Goebbels understood that propaganda must be omnipresent, but not always obvious. It wasn't just the dramatic rallies and inflammatory speeches, it was the subtle messages in entertainment, in children's books, in academic curricula. The goal was to make Nazi ideology seem like common sense, to make alternative viewpoints literally unthinkable. A German child growing up in the 1930s would encounter anti-Semitic messages in their math textbooks, their bedtime stories, their popular songs. By the time they were adults, hatred had been normalized to the point where genocide could seem logical, even necessary. Consider the insidious nature of how this worked in everyday life. A math problem in a Nazi textbook might read, "The construction of a lunatic asylum costs 6 million marks. How many houses at 15,000 marks each could have been built for that amount?" This wasn't just math, it was teaching children that caring for the mentally ill was a waste of resources. A geography lesson about living space would subtly justify expansion into other countries. A biology class about heredity would reinforce ideas of racial superiority. Every subject, every lesson became a vehicle for ideology. The secret police are perhaps the most visible symbol of dictatorial power, but their true power lies not in what they do, but in what people imagine they might do. The Gestapo in Nazi Germany actually had relatively few agents. At its peak, there was roughly one Gestapo officer for every 10,000 citizens. But everyone believed they were everywhere, that neighbors, colleagues, even family members might be informants. This paranoia was the real power. It made people police themselves, censor their own thoughts, betray others preemptively to prove their loyalty. Stalin perfected this system with his NKVD, later KGB, creating a society where everyone was simultaneously watched and watcher. Children were encouraged to inform on their parents, wives on husbands, friends on friends. The story of Pavlik Morozov, a boy who reportedly turned in his own father for anti-Soviet activities and was then killed by his family, was turned into official propaganda, with Pavlik held up as a hero and role model for Soviet children. Whether the story was true or not didn't matter. What mattered was the message. Loyalty to the state supersedes all other bonds. The psychological brilliance of this system was that it made everyone complicit. Even if you never directly reported anyone, you knew things and stayed silent. You attended the meetings, you applauded the speeches, You participated in the denunciations. Each small act of compliance made the next one easier, until people found themselves so morally compromised that resistance seemed impossible. You became your own jailer, carrying the prison of the regime inside your own mind. The use of terror in dictatorships is carefully calibrated. Random terror, where anyone could be arrested for any reason or no reason at all, is particularly effective because it makes everyone feel vulnerable. In Stalin's Great Terror, the NKVD had quotas for arrests and executions. Officers who didn't meet their quotas were themselves suspected of disloyalty. This created a machinery of death that operated on its own logic, consuming millions of innocent people, not because they had done anything wrong, but because the system demanded victims. The arbitrariness was the point. If people could be arrested for actual crimes against the regime, they might feel safe by simply following the rules. But when your neighbor disappears in the night for no discernible reason, when being too enthusiastic or not enthusiastic enough could both be crimes, when the rules constantly change and contradict each other, the only rational response is paralysis. People become afraid to act, to speak, even to think, because any action might be the wrong one. But terror alone isn't enough to maintain power. Dictators also need supporters, collaborators, and true believers. They create systems of privilege and punishment that make collaboration seem like the only rational choice. In Nazi Germany, joining the party opened doors to jobs, education, and social advancement. Refusing to participate meant marginalization at best, suspicion and persecution at worst. Most people weren't heroes or villains. They were ordinary individuals trying to survive, to protect their families, to get ahead. The dictator's genius lies in making participation in evil seem normal, necessary, even virtuous. The corruption of language is a subtle but powerful tool of control. Dictatorships don't just lie, they fundamentally alter the meaning of words until communication itself becomes impossible. In Nazi Germany, mass murder became special treatment. Concentration camps became protective custody. In the Soviet Union, forced labor camps were corrective labor colonies, and state-induced famines were difficulties with food supply. In Pol Pot's Cambodia, execution was going to study, and the killing fields were rice fields. When words lose their meaning, it becomes impossible to articulate opposition or even to think clearly about what's happening. This linguistic manipulation goes deeper than euphemism. In Orwell's 1984, he invented the concept of newspeak, a language designed to make certain thoughts literally impossible to express. While no real dictatorship went quite that far, they all understood the power of controlling language. In Mao's China, the constantly shifting political vocabulary meant that yesterday's correct terminology could be today's counter-revolutionary crime. People had to constantly monitor their speech, updating their vocabulary to match the current party line. This exhausting vigilance left little mental energy for actual critical thought. The destruction of civil society, all the organizations, associations, and relationships that exist between the individual and the state, is essential to totalitarian control. Dictators understand that isolated individuals are powerless, so they systematically destroy or co-opt every form of social organization. Churches are closed or converted into propaganda organs. Labor unions become tools of state control. Professional associations are purged and reorganized. Even chess clubs and gardening societies are viewed with suspicion unless they're explicitly aligned with the regime. In Nazi Germany, this process was called Gleichschaltung, coordination or synchronization. Every organization, from the Boy Scouts to professional associations, was either disbanded or brought under Nazi control. The Hitler Youth replaced independent youth organizations. The German Labor Front replaced independent unions. Even singing clubs and hiking groups had to be coordinated with Nazi ideology. The goal was to ensure that every social interaction happened within a framework controlled by the state. Mao's China took this to its logical extreme during the Cultural Revolution, attempting to destroy every social bond except loyalty to Mao himself. Children were encouraged to denounce their parents as counter-revolutionaries. Husbands and wives were separated and sent to different provinces. Traditional respect for elders and teachers was replaced with revolutionary fervor. The goal was to create a society of atomized individuals with no loyalty except to the state, no authority except the party, no truth except what Mao declared. The family unit, the most basic human social structure, became a particular target. The regime understood that family loyalty could compete with state loyalty, so they worked to corrupt and destroy family bonds. Children were taught that their first loyalty was to the state, not their parents. In extreme cases, like in Pol Pot's Cambodia, children were separated from parents and raised by the state, taught to see their biological parents as potential enemies. The destruction of the family meant the destruction of the primary source of alternative values and emotional support. The control of the economy is another crucial element of dictatorial power. When the state controls your job, your food rations, your housing, resistance becomes almost impossible. In the Soviet Union, losing your job didn't just mean unemployment. It could mean losing your apartment, your access to food stores, your children's education. In North Korea today, the Songbun system classifies every citizen based on their perceived loyalty, determining everything from food rations to marriage prospects. Your grandfather's perceived disloyalty could doom you to a lifetime of poverty and suspicion. This economic control created a particularly insidious form of oppression. People weren't just afraid of the secret police, they were afraid of their boss, their landlord, their ration distributor. Every person with even the smallest amount of power could destroy your life by denouncing you or simply denying you resources. This created a society where everyone was constantly vulnerable, constantly needing to prove their loyalty, constantly afraid of falling out of favor. The creation of external enemies is essential for maintaining internal control. There must always be someone to blame for failures, someone to fear, someone to hate. For Hitler, it was the Jews and Bolsheviks. For Stalin, it was capitalists and saboteurs. For Pol Pot, it was Vietnamese agents and intellectuals. These enemies serve multiple purposes. They justify repression, explain failures, and unite the population against a common threat. The enemies are simultaneously pathetically weak and thus contemptible, and incredibly powerful and thus dangerous, a contradiction that somehow makes perfect sense in the twisted logic of totalitarianism. The enemy also serves as a projection screen for the regime's own crimes. When Stalin's agricultural policies caused famine, it was blamed on saboteurs and hoarders. When Hitler's war brought destruction to Germany, it was blamed on Jewish influence. The enemy becomes responsible for everything wrong in society, allowing the regime to never acknowledge failure or accept responsibility. This creates a psychological escape valve. People's frustrations and anger can be directed at the designated enemy rather than the real source of their suffering. The indoctrination of children is perhaps the most insidious aspect of dictatorial control. Hitler famously said, "Give me a child when he's 7 and he's mine forever." Dictators understand that adults may comply out of fear, but children can be made into true believers. The Hitler Youth, the Young Pioneers, the Red Guards, these organizations didn't just teach loyalty to the regime, they provided community, purpose, and identity to young people. They made children feel special, important, part of something greater than themselves. By the time these children realized they had been manipulated, if they ever did, they were often too complicit to turn back. The education system became a factory for producing loyal citizens. History was rewritten to glorify the regime and demonize its enemies. Science was distorted to support ideological claims. Literature was censored to remove dangerous ideas. Children learned not to think critically, but to repeat approved thoughts. They were taught what to think, not how to think. The damage this did to entire generations is incalculable. Millions of people grew up intellectually crippled, unable to question or analyze, trained only to obey and repeat. The systematic destruction of truth and its replacement with ideological correctness corrodes the very possibility of rational thought. In Stalin's Soviet Union, scientists who contradicted official ideology, even in matters of genetics or physics, could be imprisoned or executed. The case of Trofim Lysenko is instructive. His crackpot theories about agriculture were adopted as official policy because they aligned with Marxist ideology, resulting in agricultural disasters that contributed to famines killing millions. But no one could challenge Lysenko without being branded a counter-revolutionary. In Mao's China, stating obvious truths like there is no food during a famine was counter-revolutionary. During the Great Leap Forward, local officials reported impossible grain harvests to meet quotas, and these fantasy numbers became official truth. Policies were based on these lies. Grain was requisitioned based on these false numbers, and millions starved while the official position was that harvests were better than ever. When objective reality becomes subordinate to political orthodoxy, society loses its ability to solve problems or even recognize them. The spectacle of public trials and confessions serves multiple purposes in maintaining control. The Moscow show trials of the 1930s, where old Bolsheviks confessed to impossible crimes before being executed, weren't really about justice or even propaganda. They were about demonstrating the regime's absolute power over reality itself. If the state could make hardened revolutionaries confess to being foreign agents, if it could make innocent people plead guilty to imaginary crimes, then resistance truly was futile. The message was clear. The state doesn't just control your body, it controls your mind, your memory, your very sense of self. These show trials also serve to educate the public about the current party line. The specific crimes the defendants confessed to revealed what thoughts and actions were currently considered dangerous. The elaborate confessions, often rehearsed and scripted, taught the public the proper way to think and speak about political matters. They were perverse morality plays, where the moral was always the same. The party is always right. Deviation means death, and even thoughts can be crimes. The use of concentration camps and gulags goes beyond mere punishment or elimination of enemies. These institutions serve as universities of terror, teaching entire populations what happens to those who resist. The knowledge that such places exist, that anyone could be sent there, that people disappear and never return, creates a climate of fear that extends far beyond the camps themselves. Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote about the Gulag Archipelago, a vast network of camps that existed like a parallel universe within the Soviet Union, invisible but ever present in everyone's consciousness. But the camps served another purpose. They were economic institutions, providing slave labor for the regime's projects. The Soviet gulags built canals, mined gold, logged forests. Nazi concentration camps provided labor for German industries. This economic exploitation added another layer of evil. Not only were people imprisoned and killed, but their suffering was profitable. Companies and government agencies had incentives to support the camp system because they benefited from the cheap labor. The exploitation of human weakness is central to dictatorial control. Dictators understand that most people aren't heroes. They have families to protect, ambitions to pursue, weaknesses to exploit. The Stasi in East Germany reportedly had one informant for every 6.5 citizens, but many of these informants weren't ideological zealots. They were people blackmailed over affairs, threatened about their children's futures, or simply worn down by constant pressure. The system turned human frailty into a tool of oppression, making everyone potentially complicit in their own subjugation. The regime would collect information about everyone, their habits, their relationships, their secrets. This information became leverage. A man having an affair could be forced to inform on his colleagues. A woman with a sick child could be offered better medical care in exchange for cooperation. A student wanting to attend university could be required to report on their classmates. These networks of compromise and complicity meant that almost everyone was both victim and perpetrator, making clear moral judgments impossible and resistance psychologically difficult. The creation of parallel realities for different segments of the population is a sophisticated technique of control. In Nazi Germany, many Germans could claim ignorance of the Holocaust because it was carefully hidden from them, even as it was happening in their midst. In the Soviet Union, party elites had access to special stores, hospitals, and schools, living in a different world from ordinary citizens. This compartmentalization prevents unified resistance and creates investment in the system among those who benefit from it. The average German citizen in 1942 might know that Jews had been relocated, but not know about the gas chambers. They might benefit from property confiscated from Jews without fully understanding what happened to the former owners. This plausible deniability allowed people to participate in evil while maintaining a sense of their own innocence. It's a psychological trick that dictatorships perfected, allowing people to know enough to be complicit, but not enough to feel fully responsible. The ritualization of loyalty through mandatory demonstrations, parades, and celebrations serves to normalize submission. In North Korea, citizens must participate in elaborate displays of grief when a leader dies, performances so extreme they seem absurd to outside observers, but deadly serious to participants who know that insufficient enthusiasm could mean death. These rituals don't just demonstrate loyalty, they create it. When you've spent years bowing to portraits and singing hymns to the leader, resistance becomes not just dangerous, but psychologically difficult. These rituals also serve to exhaust people physically and emotionally. In Nazi Germany, there was always another rally to attend, another collection to contribute to, another demonstration of loyalty required. In Mao's China, there were endless political meetings, self-criticism sessions, and study groups. People had no time or energy for independent thought or action. They were too busy performing loyalty to actually consider whether they were truly loyal. The appropriation of religious and spiritual language and symbolism gives dictatorships a quasi-religious character. Stalin became the father of the Soviet people, Hitler the savior of Germany, Kim Il-sung the eternal president of North Korea, even after death. This isn't just megalomania, it's a deliberate strategy to tap into deep human needs for meaning, belonging, and transcendence. When the state becomes a religion and the leader becomes a god, opposition becomes not just treason, but heresy. The religious nature of these regimes extended to concepts of sin and redemption. In Mao's China, having the wrong class background was like original sin, something you were born with and could never fully escape. But through constant vigilance, self-criticism, and revolutionary fervor, you might achieve a kind of redemption. This gave people hope while keeping them perpetually insecure, always striving to prove their worth to the regime. The management of hope is as important as the management of fear. Dictators must balance terror with just enough hope to prevent complete despair and potential desperate resistance. There's always the possibility of redemption through correct behavior, always the promise that things will get better once the current enemies are defeated, always the next 5-year plan that will bring prosperity. Hope becomes another chain, keeping people compliant in the belief that patience and obedience will eventually be rewarded. This false hope was carefully cultivated. In the Soviet Union, there was always talk of the coming communist paradise, just a few more years of sacrifice away. In Nazi Germany, there was the promise of the 1,000-year Reich, the Lebensraum that would provide prosperity for all Germans. These promises were never meant to be fulfilled. They were meant to keep people working, fighting, and obeying in pursuit of an impossible dream. As we near the end of this chapter, it's important to understand that these mechanisms of control weren't separate systems, but interlocking parts of a single machine. The propaganda made the terror seem justified. The economic control made resistance practically impossible. The destruction of civil society left individuals isolated and powerless. The corruption of language made opposition literally unspeakable. Each element reinforced the others, creating a totalitarian system that seemed invulnerable. Yet these systems, for all their sophistication, contained the seeds of their own destruction. The lies became harder to maintain as reality diverged ever further from propaganda. The terror created enemies faster than it could eliminate them. The economic inefficiencies of central control led to stagnation and decline. The corruption of truth made it impossible to address real problems. The very totality of control made the system brittle, unable to adapt, unable to reform, unable to respond to change, except through more control, more terror, more lies. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps reflect on the fragility of freedom and how easily it can be lost, not in dramatic battles, but in small surrenders, not through invasion, but through internal corruption. The machinery of terror that dictators construct is ultimately made possible by ordinary people making ordinary compromises, accepting small lies, remaining silent about minor injustices. Understanding how these systems work is the first step in ensuring they never arise again. The techniques we've explored tonight are not merely historical curiosities. They're patterns that can emerge in any society, in any era, when conditions are right and vigilance fails. The control of information, the destruction of civil society, the corruption of language, the exploitation of fear and hope, these are tools that remain effective because they exploit fundamental aspects of human psychology and social organization. Sleep peacefully, knowing that understanding these dark mechanisms helps us recognize and resist their emergence. May your dreams be of freedom, truth, and the courage of those who resist oppression, even in its most sophisticated forms. Tomorrow, remember that freedom requires not just the absence of tyranny, but the active presence of truth, justice, and civic courage. Rest well, knowing that by understanding how dictatorships control populations, we become better equipped to protect and preserve freedom. The machinery of terror is powerful, but it's not invincible. It can be resisted, It can be dismantled, and it can be prevented from arising in the first place, but only if we understand how it works and remain vigilant against its construction. Chapter 3: The Human Cost: Victims, Resistance, and Survival. As we settle deeper into our historical journey tonight, we must confront the most difficult aspect of studying dictatorships: the human cost. Behind the statistics and historical analyses are real people with names, faces, families, and dreams. Each number in the millions killed represents an individual tragedy, a life cut short, a family destroyed, a future erased. Yet within these dark stories, we also find remarkable tales of courage, resistance, and the persistence of human dignity, even in the face of absolute evil. The scale of suffering under history's worst dictators is almost incomprehensible. Stalin's regime killed an estimated 20 million people. Mao's policies led to the deaths of perhaps 45 million. Hitler's Holocaust claimed 6 million Jews and millions of others. Pol Pot killed a quarter of Cambodia's population in just 4 years. These numbers are so large they become abstract, losing their power to convey the reality of what happened. As Stalin himself reportedly said, "One death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic." Our task tonight is to remember that each of those millions was a tragedy. Let's begin with the story of Primo Levi, an Italian Jewish chemist who survived Auschwitz. His experience reminds us that victims of dictatorships weren't just numbers, they were complex individuals with rich inner lives. Levi wrote about how the camps were designed not just to kill, but to dehumanize, to reduce people to what he called the drowned, those who had lost their humanity before losing their lives. Yet even in Auschwitz, Levi found moments of grace, a fellow prisoner who shared his bread, a few lines of Dante remembered and recited, a moment of scientific curiosity that reminded him he was still human. The methods of mass killing varied, but they all shared a common thread of bureaucratic efficiency, married to ideological fervor. The Holocaust's gas chambers, the Soviet gulags work-to-death camps, the Khmer Rouge's killing fields, Mao's forced famines, each represented a different approach to the same horrific goal: the elimination of those deemed enemies or obstacles to the dictator's vision. What's perhaps most chilling is how ordinary people became cogs in these machines of death, filing paperwork, driving trains, guarding camps, participating in mass murder as if it were just another job. The story of Zhang Jixin, a Chinese Communist Party member who dared to criticize Mao during the Cultural Revolution, illustrates the particular cruelty of ideological persecution. Arrested in 1969 for suggesting that Mao had made mistakes, she was tortured for 6 years before being executed in 1975. Before her execution, her vocal cords were cut so she couldn't shout anti-Mao slogans at her public execution. Her children were forced to denounce her and weren't told of her death until years later. Her story shows how dictatorships destroy not just individuals, but families, forcing people to choose between loved ones and survival. The targeting of specific groups for elimination reveals the calculated nature of dictatorial violence. Hitler's Holocaust began with the disabled, the so-called useless eaters, before expanding to Jews, Roma, Slavs, and others deemed racially inferior. Stalin's purges targeted kulaks, prosperous peasants, ethnic minorities, intellectuals, and eventually anyone who might pose a threat, real or imagined. Pol Pot targeted anyone with education, even those who wore glasses, seeing them as corrupted by foreign influence. The logic of elimination, once accepted, inevitably expands until no one is safe. Children suffered uniquely under dictatorships. In the Holocaust, 1.5 million Jewish children were murdered. In Cambodia, children were turned into executioners, with the Khmer Rouge using them to kill adults because they were seen as pure and uncorrupted. In Stalin's USSR, children of enemies of the people were sent to orphanages where they were given new names and told their parents were traitors. In Mao's China, during the Cultural Revolution, children denounced and beat their teachers and parents. The corruption of childhood innocence is perhaps the ultimate crime of these regimes. Yet, even in the darkest moments, people resisted. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of 1943, where poorly armed Jews fought the Nazi war machine for almost a month, wasn't about military victory. It was about dying with dignity, about choosing how to face death. As one fighter, Mordecai Anielewicz, wrote, "The dream of my life has come true. I have lived to see Jewish defense in the ghetto in all its greatness and glory." The uprising was crushed, but it showed that even in hopeless situations, people could choose resistance over submission. Resistance took many forms, not all of them violent. In Nazi-occupied Denmark, when the order came to round up Jews, ordinary Danes helped ferry almost the entire Jewish population to safety in Sweden. In Bulgaria, public protests led by Orthodox church leaders prevented the deportation of Bulgarian Jews. These acts of collective resistance show that dictatorships aren't invincible. They can be resisted when people act together with courage and determination. The story of Sophie Scholl and the White Rose Resistance Group in Nazi Germany demonstrates the power of moral resistance. These university students distributed leaflets calling on Germans to resist the Nazi regime, knowing they faced almost certain death if caught. Sophie was 21 when she was executed in 1943. At her trial, she said, "Somebody, after all, had to make a start." What we wrote and said is also believed by many others. They just don't dare express themselves as we did. Her courage inspired others and continues to inspire today, showing that even doomed resistance has meaning and power. In the Soviet Gulag, resistance often took the form of maintaining humanity in human conditions. Prisoners organized secret schools, held clandestine religious services, and created art and literature in their minds when paper was forbidden. Varlam Shalamov, who spent 17 years in the Kolyma camps, wrote stories that preserved the memory of those who died, ensuring their suffering wouldn't be forgotten. He wrote, "I was convinced that I should return alive and should tell of what I had seen and understood." This commitment to bearing witness was itself a form of resistance. The role of memory and testimony in resistance cannot be overstated. Anne Frank's diary, written while hiding from the Nazis, has taught millions about the Holocaust. Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago exposed the Soviet camp system to the world. Dith Pran's escape from Cambodia and subsequent testimony brought international attention to the Khmer Rouge genocide. These witnesses understood that dictators depend on silence and forgetting. By remembering and testifying, survivors strike a blow against tyranny that extends far beyond their own lifetimes. The psychological impact on survivors is profound and lasting. Many Holocaust survivors experienced what came to be known as survivor's guilt, the questioning of why they lived when so many died. Was it luck? Did their survival come at the cost of someone else's death? These questions haunted many for the rest of their lives. Primo Levi, despite surviving and bearing powerful witness through his writing, struggled with depression and died in what many believe was suicide 40 years after his liberation from Auschwitz. Families were systematically destroyed by dictatorships, and the trauma rippled through generations. In Argentina's Dirty War, children of disappeared dissidents were given to military families to raise. In Stalin's USSR, children of purged officials grew up not knowing if their parents were alive or dead, heroes or traitors. In North Korea today, 3 generations of a family can be punished for one person's perceived disloyalty. The destruction of family bonds, the most basic human connection, was both a tool of control and a source of immeasurable suffering. Women faced particular horrors under dictatorships. Beyond the general violence, they often faced sexual assault as a weapon of terror. In the rape of Nanking under Japanese occupation, in the comfort women's system, in the systematic rapes during the Bangladeshi genocide, sexual violence was used to destroy not just individuals, but entire communities. Yet women also played crucial roles in resistance, as couriers, spies, and fighters. The Night Witches, Soviet female pilots who flew bombing missions against the Nazis, showed that women could fight back with devastating effectiveness. The story of Nadezhda Mandelstam illustrates a different kind of heroism. After her husband, the poet Osip Mandelstam, was arrested by Stalin's regime for writing an epigram mocking the dictator, she spent decades memorizing his poems to preserve them, knowing that written copies were too dangerous. She and other wives of purged men formed an invisible sisterhood, supporting each other and preserving the memory of their disappeared husbands. Her memoirs, written decades later, became crucial documents of the Stalin era. The choices people faced under dictatorships were often impossible. The Jewish councils, Judenräte, in Nazi ghettos had to choose which of their people to send to death camps, hoping to save some by sacrificing others. Parents had to decide whether to hide their children's Jewish identity, knowing it meant erasing their heritage. In Cambodia, people had to choose between starving in the cities or joining the Khmer Rouge exodus to the countryside. These weren't choices between good and evil, but between different forms of suffering, different ways of trying to survive. The international community's failure to respond to these atrocities is a painful part of the story. The world knew about the Holocaust while it was happening, but did little to stop it. The New York Times buried stories about the systematic murder of Jews in its back pages. The Allies refused to bomb the rail lines to Auschwitz. Later, the world stood by during the Cambodian genocide, the Rwandan genocide, and others. The phrase "never again," coined after the Holocaust, has been followed by again and again. Yet there were also heroes among the international community. Raoul Wallenberg, a Swedish diplomat, saved thousands of Hungarian Jews by issuing protective passports. Oskar Schindler, a German industrialist, saved over 1,000 Jews by employing them in his factories. Chiune Sugihara, a Japanese diplomat, defied his government's orders and issued visas that saved thousands of Jewish refugees. These individuals show that even in the darkest times, people can choose to act with courage and compassion. The concept of righteous among the nations, non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust, reveals the complexity of human behavior under extreme circumstances. These weren't saints or superheroes, but ordinary people who made extraordinary choices. A Polish sewer worker who hid Jews in the sewers of Lvov, a French village that collectively sheltered Jewish children, a German army officer who warned Jews of upcoming raids. Their stories remind us that even under totalitarian regimes, individual conscience can survive and act. The long-term effects of living under dictatorship extend far beyond the regime's fall. In post-Soviet Russia, many people struggled with freedom, having internalized the oppression. In Cambodia, the destruction of educated classes left a country struggling to rebuild basic institutions. In post-war Germany, the process of denazification and coming to terms with collective guilt took generations. The poison of dictatorship doesn't disappear when the dictator dies. It lingers in traumatized populations, destroyed institutions, and corrupted values. Children who grew up under dictatorships often struggled to understand normal life after liberation. Chinese youth who had been Red Guards during the Cultural Revolution found themselves uneducated and unprepared for regular society. Children hidden during the Holocaust emerged not knowing how to interact normally with others. The stolen childhoods couldn't be returned. The lost education couldn't be easily replaced. The psychological damage couldn't be quickly healed. The diaspora communities created by dictatorships became repositories of memory and culture. Cuban exiles in Miami, Vietnamese boat people around the world, Jews scattered from Europe, these communities preserved what dictatorships tried to destroy. They maintained languages, traditions, and memories that would have otherwise been lost. They also became voices for those still trapped under tyranny, advocating for international action and keeping attention focused on ongoing oppression. The role of art and literature in processing and communicating the experience of dictatorship has been crucial. Picasso's Guernica captured the horror of fascist violence. Shostakovich's symphonies encoded criticism of Stalin that couldn't be spoken aloud. The poems of Paul Celan, a Holocaust survivor, gave voice to unspeakable loss. These artistic works don't just document atrocity, they transform it into something that can be comprehended, felt, and remembered by those who didn't experience it directly. The question of justice after dictatorship is complex and often unsatisfying. The Nuremberg trials established important precedents, but could only prosecute a fraction of those responsible for the Holocaust. Many Nazi war criminals escaped to South America. Stalin's executioners mostly died peacefully in their beds. Pol Pot lived freely for years after his regime fell. The survivors often had to live with the knowledge that their tormentors faced no justice, adding another layer to their suffering. Truth and reconciliation commissions, like those in South Africa and Latin America, have attempted different approaches to dealing with the legacy of dictatorship. Rather than punishment, they focus on acknowledgement, testimony, and sometimes forgiveness. These processes are imperfect and often unsatisfying, but they represent attempts to heal societies torn apart by systematic violence and oppression. The survivors who chose to return to normal life, to rebuild, to have families and careers, performed their own form of resistance. Every Jewish child born after the Holocaust is a defeat of Hitler's plan. Every Cambodian who learned to read after Pol Pot is a repudiation of his anti-intellectual ideology. Every person who maintained their humanity through inhuman circumstances proved that the human spirit, while it can be damaged, cannot be completely destroyed. As we near the end of this chapter, let's remember Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist who wrote about finding meaning even in the concentration camps. He observed that while prisoners couldn't control their circumstances, they could control their response to those circumstances. Some became brutal, others maintained their humanity. Some gave up, others found reasons to continue. His insight that even in the most extreme situations, humans retain some element of choice, some spark of freedom, offers both hope and responsibility. The stories we've explored tonight are difficult to hear, but they're essential to remember. They remind us that evil is real, that human beings are capable of inflicting unimaginable suffering on each other, but also that resistance is possible, that dignity can be maintained even in the face of systematic dehumanization, and that the human spirit, while fragile, is also remarkably resilient. As you drift towards sleep, perhaps hold in your mind not just the horror of what humans can do to each other, but also the courage of those who resisted, the compassion of those who helped, and the strength of those who survived. Their stories remind us that even in the darkest chapters of human history, there were always those who chose light over darkness, humanity over brutality, resistance over submission. The victims of history's worst dictators deserve to be remembered not just as victims, but as full human beings who lived, loved, hoped, and struggled. Their suffering was not meaningless if we learn from it, if we recognize the warning signs of tyranny, if we commit ourselves to preventing such horrors from recurring. In remembering them, we honor them. In learning from their experiences, we guard against repetition. May your dreams be peaceful, and may you wake with renewed appreciation for freedom, democracy, and human rights, things that can seem ordinary until we remember how many millions died for lack of them. Rest well, knowing that by understanding these dark chapters of history, we become better equipped to protect the light. Chapter 4: The Fall of Tyrants and Lessons for Humanity. As we reach the final chapter of our journey through history's darkest corridors, let's explore how dictatorships end, why they fall, and what lessons we can draw from their rise and demise. There's something deeply satisfying about knowing that no dictatorship lasts forever, that every tyrant eventually falls, though often not soon enough, and at terrible cost. Understanding how these regimes ended and why some lasted longer than others offers crucial insights for protecting freedom in our own time. The death of Adolf Hitler in his bunker beneath Berlin, as Soviet forces closed in, was perhaps the most dramatic end of any dictator. On April 30th, 1945, realizing his 1,000-year Reich had lasted barely 12 years, Hitler shot himself rather than face capture. His body was burned in the Chancellery Garden, a pathetic end for someone who had brought such suffering to the world. Yet even in death, Hitler tried to control the narrative, dictating a final testament that blamed everyone but himself for Germany's defeat. The man who had promised to make Germany great again left it divided, occupied, and bearing the shame of unprecedented genocide. In those final days in the bunker, Hitler's deterioration was complete. Witnesses described a trembling, paranoid figure, ranting about betrayal while moving imaginary armies on maps. He married Eva Braun just hours before their joint suicide, a bizarre attempt at normalcy in the midst of apocalypse. He ordered the destruction of Germany's remaining infrastructure. If he couldn't have Germany, no one would. This scorched earth order, largely ignored by his remaining generals, revealed the ultimate narcissism of the dictator. The nation existed only to serve his glory, and without him, it deserved only destruction. What's striking about Hitler's end is how quickly the Nazi regime collapsed once he was gone. Within days, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The elaborate system of terror and control, the SS and Gestapo, the concentration camps and propaganda ministry, all of it crumbled almost immediately. This reveals a fundamental weakness of highly personalized dictatorships. They're often more fragile than they appear, held together by the force of a single personality rather than robust institutions. The immediate aftermath was surreal. Hermann Göring, once Hitler's designated successor, tried to negotiate with the Allies as if he were a legitimate leader. Heinrich Himmler, architect of the Holocaust, attempted to reinvent himself as a reasonable statesman. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda master, killed his 6 children and then himself and his wife, unable to imagine a world without National Socialism. These men who had seemed so powerful were revealed as pathetic figures, their authority evaporating the moment their Führer died. Stalin's death on March 5, 1953, was different but equally instructive. He died of a stroke, lying in his own urine for hours because his guards were too terrified to check on him without permission. The man who had terrorized millions died in fear himself, paranoid to the end, having recently purged his doctors in the alleged doctor's plot. His inner circle, men who had participated in countless atrocities at his command, reportedly celebrated privately when they confirmed he was dead. Lavrenti Beria, his secret police chief, allegedly said, "The tyrant is dead." The scene of Stalin's death was almost Shakespearean. He had dismissed his guards with explicit orders not to disturb him. When he didn't emerge from his room the next day, they were too frightened to check. Disobeying Stalin, even to potentially save his life, could mean death. When they finally found him, he was conscious but unable to speak, his eyes full of rage and fear. His daughter Svetlana later wrote that his final gesture was to raise his hand as if cursing everyone present. The man who had controlled the fate of millions couldn't control his own bladder in his final hours. The aftermath of Stalin's death shows how dictatorships can evolve rather than collapse. The Soviet system survived for another 38 years, but it was never the same. His inner circle immediately moved to prevent any one person from accumulating such power again. They released millions from the gulags, rehabilitated some of Stalin's victims, and began a slow process of de-Stalinization. Nikita Khrushchev's secret speech in 1956, denouncing Stalin's cult of personality and crimes, sent shockwaves through the communist world. Some true believers committed suicide, unable to reconcile the truth with their faith in Stalin. Yet the process of de-Stalinization was itself revealing. The system couldn't fully acknowledge Stalin's crimes without undermining its own legitimacy. So they blamed everything on the cult of personality, as if Stalin had single-handedly corrupted an otherwise noble system. The millions who had participated in the terror, the informants, the guards, the bureaucrats who signed death warrants, were allowed to pretend they too were victims. This selective memory allowed the system to continue while pretending to reform. Mao Zedong's death in 1976 followed a similar pattern. The architect of the Great Leap Forward, which caused the worst famine in human history, and the Cultural Revolution, which destroyed Chinese society for a decade, died peacefully in his bed at 82. His final years were marked by increasing senility and paranoia. He could barely speak, communicating through written notes and grunts. Yet even in this diminished state, his word was law, his every utterance analyzed for hidden meaning by terrified subordinates. Within weeks of Mao's death, his radical supporters, including his wife Jiang Qing and the Gang of Four, were arrested. The speed of their fall revealed how thin their support really was. They had power only through Mao, and without him, they were immediately vulnerable. China began its transformation under Deng Xiaoping, maintaining authoritarian political control while liberalizing the economy. Mao's preserved body still lies in state in Beijing, a reminder of how dictators try to achieve immortality even in death. Yet modern China, while still authoritarian, has largely abandoned Maoism, keeping only the symbols while rejecting the substance. The trial of the Gang of Four became a way for China to process the trauma of the Cultural Revolution without fully confronting it. Jiang Qing, Mao's widow, remained defiant, declaring, "I was Chairman Mao's dog. Whoever he told me to bite, I bit." Her statement contained an uncomfortable truth. She and the others were scapegoats for crimes that implicated millions. By blaming a small group for the excesses of the Cultural Revolution, Chinese society could avoid confronting its collective participation in the madness. The fall of Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge in 1979 came not from internal collapse, but from external invasion. Vietnam, itself a communist country, invaded Cambodia to stop the genocide and install a friendlier regime. Pol Pot fled to the jungle, where he maintained a guerrilla force for years, dying in 1998 under mysterious circumstances, possibly murdered by his own followers. The fact that it took foreign invasion to stop the Cambodian genocide raises uncomfortable questions about international responsibility and the limits of sovereignty when governments murder their own people. What's remarkable about Pol Pot's final years is how he maintained his delusions to the end. In interviews, he claimed he had a clear conscience, that his intentions were good, that any deaths were the fault of Vietnamese agents and traitors. He lived comfortably in the jungle, protected by Thailand and indirectly by the United States, who saw his forces as a counterweight to Vietnamese influence. The man responsible for killing a quarter of Cambodia's population died peacefully in his sleep, never facing justice. Some dictators remarkably died peacefully after decades in power. Francisco Franco ruled Spain for 36 years, dying in his bed in 1975 at age 82. His death was prolonged and undignified, kept alive by machines for weeks while his subordinates maneuvered for position. Spanish society was so traumatized that they chose a pact of forgetting, agreeing not to prosecute crimes from the Civil War and dictatorship in order to move forward peacefully. This transition, while successful in preventing violence, meant that many who participated in atrocities never faced justice. Kim Il-sung ruled North Korea for 46 years before dying of a heart attack in 1994, successfully passing power to his son Kim Jong-il, who in turn passed it to Kim Jong-un. This hereditary dictatorship, unique among communist regimes, has now lasted 3 generations. The Kim dynasty's survival shows that dictatorships can institutionalize themselves, creating systems that outlast their founders. North Korea remains the world's most totalitarian state, a living museum of Stalinist control techniques refined to their ultimate expression. The fall of European communist regimes in 1989 demonstrated how quickly seemingly stable dictatorships can crumble when conditions align. The Berlin Wall, which had stood for 28 years as the ultimate symbol of oppression, fell in a single night. The catalyst was a bungled press conference where an East German official accidentally announced that border crossings would open immediately. Within hours, crowds had gathered at the wall, and confused border guards, unable to get clear orders, opened the gates. The mighty East German state, with its elaborate surveillance apparatus and feared secret police, couldn't survive a bureaucratic mistake. Romania's Nicolae Ceausescu, who had ruled with an iron fist for 24 years, went from absolute power to execution in just 10 days. On December 21, 1989, he addressed what was supposed to be a rally of support. When the crowd began booing, the look of shock on his face was broadcast on live television. That image, the moment he realized his people no longer feared him, marked the end of his regime. Within days, he and his wife were subjected to a hasty show trial and executed on Christmas Day, their bodies shown on television to prove they were really dead. The role of individual courage in bringing down dictatorships cannot be overstated. Tank Man, the unknown protester who stood in front of tanks in Tiananmen Square in 1989, became an icon of resistance even though the Chinese regime survived. His simple act, one person with shopping bags facing down a column of tanks, showed the world that the Chinese government's power wasn't absolute, that individuals could still choose to resist. Though we don't know his fate, his courage inspired millions. Lech Wałęsa, an electrician who led Poland's Solidarity movement, helped bring down communist rule in Eastern Europe. What started as a strike in the Gdańsk shipyards became a nationwide movement that the government couldn't suppress despite declaring martial law. Wałęsa's genius was understanding that the communist regime's legitimacy rested on claiming to represent workers. When the workers themselves rejected the party, its ideological foundation crumbled. Václav Havel, the Czech playwright turned dissident, turned president, embodied a different kind of resistance. His essay, The Power of the Powerless, argued that simply living in truth, refusing to participate in the regime's lies, was itself a form of resistance. He showed that even totalitarian regimes depend on the cooperation of ordinary people, and when enough people withdraw that cooperation, the regime becomes unsustainable. The importance of international pressure in ending dictatorships is complex and often controversial. Economic sanctions contributed to the fall of apartheid in South Africa, but they also caused suffering among the very people they were meant to help. The Helsinki Accords of 1975, which seemed to legitimize Soviet control over Eastern Europe, actually provided dissidents with a tool to pressure their governments on human rights. Sometimes international engagement works better than isolation, sometimes the opposite is true, and often it's impossible to know in advance. The role of technology in challenging dictatorships has evolved dramatically. The printing press helped spread dissent against absolute monarchies. Radio broadcasts penetrated the Iron Curtain, bringing alternative narratives to closed societies. The internet and social media helped coordinate the Arab Spring protests of 2011, leading to the fall of several long-standing dictators. Yet authoritarian regimes have also learned to use technology for surveillance and control, creating digital dictatorships that would have been unimaginable to Hitler or Stalin. China's response to the internet age shows how modern dictatorships adapt. Rather than trying to completely block information, they flood the zone with alternative narratives, making truth indistinguishable from fiction. They use artificial intelligence to monitor communications and predict dissent before it emerges. They've created a social credit system that makes every citizen their own guardian, knowing that bad behavior will affect not just them, but their families' opportunities. It's Orwell updated for the digital age. The question of what comes after dictatorship is crucial and often disappointing. The fall of the dictator doesn't automatically lead to democracy and freedom. Russia replaced Tsarist autocracy with communist totalitarianism, then evolved into a new form of authoritarianism under Putin. Many Arab Spring countries descended into civil war or saw the emergence of new strongmen. The habits of dictatorship, corruption, violence, distrust, don't disappear overnight. Building democracy requires more than just removing the dictator. It requires institutions, civil society, and democratic culture that take generations to develop. The transition from dictatorship to democracy is particularly difficult because the skills needed to destroy a regime are different from those needed to build a new one. Revolutionary leaders often make poor democratic politicians. Institutions destroyed by dictatorships, independent courts, free press, professional civil service, can't be quickly rebuilt. Trust between citizens, eroded by years of surveillance and betrayal, takes time to restore. The muscle memory of democracy atrophies under dictatorship and must be slowly rehabilitated. The persistence of dictatorship in the 21st century reminds us that the threat hasn't disappeared. North Korea maintains a totalitarian system that would be familiar to Stalin. China has combined economic development with sophisticated authoritarianism, proving that capitalism doesn't automatically lead to democracy. Russia has developed a new model of sovereign democracy that maintains democratic facades while hollowing out democratic substance. These regimes learn from each other, sharing techniques of control and propaganda. New forms of dictatorship are emerging that blur traditional categories. Illiberal democracy maintains elections but undermines the institutions that make democracy meaningful. Competitive authoritarianism allows opposition parties but ensures they can never really win. Digital authoritarianism uses technology to create surveillance states that make resistance nearly impossible. These hybrid regimes are often more stable than traditional dictatorships because they provide pressure valves for dissent while maintaining ultimate control. The psychological appeal of strongman leadership remains powerful, especially during times of crisis or rapid change. Even in established democracies, we see the appeal of leaders who promise simple solutions to complex problems, who scapegoat minorities, who attack the press and independent institutions. The techniques Hitler used to rise to power, and exploiting economic anxiety, promising national greatness, identifying enemies within and without, remain effective because they tap into fundamental human psychology. The fear of chaos, the desire for order, the appeal of strength, the comfort of certainty. These psychological needs make populations vulnerable to authoritarian appeals. When democracy seems messy and ineffective, when economic systems seem rigged, when social change seems too rapid, the strong man's promise to restore order and greatness becomes attractive. The irony is that the very freedoms that make democracy seem chaotic are what make it ultimately stronger and more adaptable than dictatorship. The role of ordinary people in sustaining or resisting dictatorship is perhaps the most important lesson. Dictatorships don't just require evil leaders, they require millions of people to participate, collaborate, or at least acquiesce. The secretary who types the execution orders, the neighbor who reports suspicious activity, the teacher who spreads propaganda, all are essential to the dictatorship's function. Conversely, when enough ordinary people withdraw their cooperation, dictatorships become impossible to maintain. This is both sobering and empowering. It means we're all potentially complicit in evil if we're not vigilant, but it also means we all have power to resist. The Czech greengrocer in Havel's essay, who stops putting propaganda in his window, the East German guard, who refuses to shoot people crossing the border, the Chinese student who stands in front of a tank. These individual acts of conscience matter. They may not bring down the regime immediately, but they preserve the possibility of freedom. The importance of memory and education in preventing future dictatorships cannot be overstated. Germany's extensive Holocaust education and memorialization efforts have helped create a society largely immunized against fascism. The German approach, acknowledging guilt, educating thoroughly, and remaining vigilant, provides a model for how societies can confront dark histories. In contrast, countries that have failed to confront their past, like Japan with its wartime atrocities, or Turkey with the Armenian genocide, remain vulnerable to nationalist manipulation and historical repetition. The role of survivors and witnesses in preserving memory is crucial. As Holocaust survivors pass away, we lose living links to that history. Their testimonies, preserved in archives and museums, become our only connection to the reality of what happened. But testimony alone isn't enough. It must be actively taught, discussed, and related to contemporary events. History doesn't repeat exactly, but patterns recur, and recognizing those patterns requires active engagement with the past. The universal patterns we see across different dictatorships suggest there are warning signs we can watch for. The demonization of minorities often comes first, creating an other who can be blamed for society's problems. Attacks on the free press follow because independent information threatens the regime's narrative. The politicization of law enforcement and judiciary removes checks on power. The creation of parallel truth systems makes rational discourse impossible. The celebration of violence normalizes what should be unthinkable. The cult of personality around the leader substitutes worship for accountability. These patterns appear whether the dictatorship is fascist or communist, secular or religious, in Europe, Asia, Africa, or Latin America. Human nature, it seems, is universally susceptible to certain forms of manipulation and control, but we also see universal patterns of resistance. The parent who teaches their child to think critically despite propaganda, the artist who encodes dissent in their work, the bureaucrat who quietly sabotages evil policies, the neighbor who hides the persecuted. These acts of resistance, often small and seemingly insignificant, preserve the human capacity for good even in the worst circumstances. The question of whether it could happen again, whether new Hitlers, Stalins, or Pol Pots could arise, is not hypothetical. Genocide has occurred since the Holocaust in Rwanda, Bosnia, Darfur, and elsewhere. The Rwandan genocide of 1994 showed how quickly neighbor can turn against neighbor when hatred is systematically promoted. In just 100 days, between 500,000 and 1 million Tutsis were killed, mostly with machetes and clubs, by their Hutu neighbors. Radio broadcasts directed killers to specific addresses, turning mass murder into a coordinated campaign that required no sophisticated technology, just human hatred. The Srebrenica massacre in 1995, where Serbian forces killed more than 8,000 Bosnian Muslim men and boys, occurred in a supposed UN-safe area in the heart of Europe, 50 years after the Holocaust. The international community's failure to prevent this atrocity, despite having troops on the ground, showed that never again remained more aspiration than reality. The perpetrators used the same dehumanizing language, the same bureaucratic efficiency, the same techniques of separation and elimination that the Nazis had pioneered. Authoritarian movements are growing globally. Democratic backsliding is occurring even in established democracies. The institutions that protect freedom, independent courts, free press, professional civil service, are under attack in many countries. The technologies of surveillance and control are more powerful than ever. Yet we also have advantages our ancestors lacked: historical knowledge, international institutions, however flawed, instant global communication, and the hard-won wisdom of survivors. We have the testimonies of those who lived through dictatorships, warning us about the signs. We have international laws and courts, imperfect but existing, that establish standards and sometimes deliver justice. We have a global civil society that can mobilize quickly to spotlight abuses. We have technologies that, while they can be used for oppression, also make it harder for regimes to hide their crimes. Most importantly, we have the knowledge that dictatorships can be resisted and defeated. The responsibility this places on us is enormous. We are the beneficiaries of those who suffered under and resisted dictatorship. Their experiences preserved in testimony, literature, and scholarship are a gift and a warning. We have no excuse for ignorance about how dictatorships rise, how they function, and how they can be resisted. The question is whether we have the wisdom to recognize dangers and the courage to confront them. As we conclude our journey through these dark chapters of human history, it's important to remember that this isn't just history, it's a continuing human challenge. The capacity for evil that created these dictatorships exists in every generation, in every society, but so does the capacity for good, for resistance, for courage. The eternal struggle between freedom and tyranny, between human dignity and dehumanization, continues in our time, in our societies, in our own choices. The dictators we've studied tonight wanted to be remembered as gods, as fathers of their nations, as world historical figures who transformed humanity. Instead, they're remembered as warnings, as examples of how power corrupts, as reminders of what humans must never become. Their victims, who they tried to erase from history, are remembered with honor. Their resistors, who they tried to silence, speak to us across the decades. Their survivors, who they tried to break, became witnesses whose testimony helps protect future generations. Hitler's 1,000-year Reich lasted 12 years. Stalin's revolution that was supposed to transform humanity created a system that collapsed from its own contradictions. Mao's permanent revolution ended with China embracing capitalism. Pol Pot's Year Zero resulted in his regime's destruction and Cambodia's slow recovery. The grand visions of these dictators all failed, leaving only suffering in their wake. Their legacies are cautionary tales, their names synonymous with evil. Yet the human spirit they tried to crush proved more resilient than they imagined. In every dictatorship, there were those who refused to surrender their humanity. In every genocide, there were those who risked their lives to save others. In every system of oppression, there were those who found ways to resist. These people, often unknown, often uncelebrated, are the true heroes of these dark chapters. They preserved the light when darkness seemed absolute. Every democracy contains the seeds of its own destruction, but also the tools for its own preservation. Free press, independent courts, robust civil society, quality education, democratic culture, these aren't luxuries but necessities for preventing dictatorship. They require constant maintenance, defense, and renewal. They require citizens who understand their value and are willing to defend them. They require the recognition that freedom isn't a natural state, but an achievement that each generation must choose to preserve. The German pastor Martin Niemöller, who initially supported the Nazis before becoming a resistor, wrote famous words that capture the danger of apathy. First, they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. His words remind us that defending freedom means defending it for everyone, especially those we might disagree with or dislike. The study of evil dictatorships ultimately teaches us about the preciousness of ordinary freedom, the ability to speak your mind, to choose your leaders, to worship or not worship as you choose, to read what you want, to associate with whom you want, to live without fear of arbitrary arrest or murder. These freedoms, which can seem mundane when we have them, are revealed as precious and fragile when we see what happens in their absence. Consider the simple acts that you take for granted: criticizing your government without fear, choosing your profession, marrying whom you love, traveling freely, reading diverse opinions, teaching your children your values. In the dictatorships we've studied, any of these acts could mean death. The freedom to live an ordinary life, to pursue happiness in your own way, to disagree and debate, and change your mind, these are extraordinary achievements that billions of people throughout history could only dream of. As you prepare to sleep tonight, Perhaps reflect on the freedoms you enjoy that millions died for lacking, the ability to access information freely, to express your thoughts without fear, to participate in choosing your leaders, or to ignore politics entirely if you choose. These aren't inevitable features of human society. They're achievements that must be actively maintained and defended. They're the result of centuries of struggle, sacrifice, and gradual progress that can be reversed if we're not vigilant. The dictators of history failed in their ultimate goal, to reshape humanity in their image, to create thousand-year Reichs, to become immortal through power. Instead, they became cautionary tales, their names synonymous with evil, their legacies ones of suffering and destruction. The future they tried to create died with them, or shortly after. The humans they tried to remake proved more resilient than they imagined. The truths they tried to destroy survived in hidden testimonies, whispered stories, and stubborn memories. Yet their victims achieved a different kind of immortality, through the memory of their suffering, the inspiration of their resistance, and the lessons their experiences teach. Anne Frank, who died at 15 in Bergen-Belsen, has taught more people about the Holocaust than Hitler ever reached with his propaganda. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who survived the Gulag, struck a blow against Soviet tyranny that no military force could match. The unknown resistors, the quiet heroes, the ordinary people who chose good over evil, they are the ones who truly shaped the future. The Warsaw Ghetto fighters who chose to die standing rather than live on their knees showed that human dignity could survive even in hell. The Danes who saved their Jewish neighbors showed that entire societies could choose good over evil. The students of the White Rose who distributed leaflets, knowing it meant death, showed that moral courage could exist even in the heart of darkness. These examples remind us that we always have choices, even in the worst circumstances. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep in freedom and safety, remember that these are not guaranteed conditions, but precious achievements. Remember that somewhere in the world tonight, people are living under dictatorship, dreaming of the freedoms you enjoy. Remember that the price of freedom truly is eternal vigilance, that each generation must choose anew whether to preserve or surrender their liberty. The stories of history's worst dictators are dark chapters in the human story, but they're not the final chapters. That remains to be written by us, by our choices, by our courage or cowardice, by our vigilance or apathy. Will we recognize the warning signs when they appear? Will we have the courage to speak out when it's still possible? Will we defend institutions that seem boring but protect freedom? Will we stand up for the marginalized when it would be easier to remain silent? These aren't abstract questions. They're daily choices that collectively determine whether freedom survives or tyranny returns. Sleep well, knowing that understanding evil is the first step to preventing it, that remembering the past helps protect the future, and that the human spirit, while capable of great evil, has consistently proven capable of even greater good. The dictators are dead, but freedom lives on. Fragile, precious, and dependent on each of us for its survival. May your dreams be peaceful, filled not with the darkness we've explored, but with gratitude for the light of freedom. May you wake tomorrow with a renewed commitment to defending human dignity, to resisting oppression in all its forms, and to learning from history so we need not repeat it. The night is long, but dawn always comes. Tyranny seems permanent, but it always falls. Evil appears triumphant, but good ultimately endures. Good night, and may the lessons of history guide us toward a future where such chapters need never be written again. Rest peacefully, knowing that by understanding the past, we help protect the future. Sweet dreams, and remember, The light you carry forward, no matter how small it seems, helps ensure that darkness never again becomes absolute.